Hi there, and a very warm welcome to you for the first in a series of digital recordings and conversations that Brook is hosting to support and to celebrate Sexual Health Week 2020. You join us at a really interesting and exciting time because for the first time in this country's history, from September, relationships education in primary schools and relationships and sex education in secondary schools will become mandatory subjects. At Brook, we have long campaigned for this to be the case, and whilst it has been a difficult road and there have certainly been some delays and some challenges, this is a really important moment, not just in the education history of this country, but also for the young people who are in our schools today and the young people who will be in our schools tomorrow and for years to come. Whilst we think that this is a really exciting time and presents us lots of really good opportunities to support young people, to create lives that are worth living and to enable them to have healthy and happy relationships, we absolutely understand that the introduction of mandatory relationships education does present schools with several challenges. And these challenges can be values-based, these challenges can be pedagogically based, these challenges can be practical. And this series of small, short digital recordings will hopefully provide some support for schools as they embark upon the new academic year, will hopefully provide some food for thought and perhaps some helpful tips, perhaps some guidance that you or your school leaders will be able to use as you roll out your mandatory relationships and sex education curriculum across the academic year. In this digital recording, I'm going to speak a little bit about some different types of teaching structures that schools can use when they are thinking about timetabling and providing a PSHE curriculum. I will be speaking and exploring a little bit about how to structure and deliver good PSHE and RSE lessons. And I will also talk a little bit about assessment and how we can assess meaningfully, how we can assess to show progress, but also to report back to parents and carers or even Ofsted if they're interested in the sort of assessment that takes place in PSHE and RSE. And finally, I will speak a little bit about safeguarding and how you can create a safe and purposeful learning environment in your school or in your classroom. I'm going to spend a couple of moments speaking about some high-level aspects to implementing mandatory RSE with regards to what a curriculum will look like and how schools can timetable in a new mandatory subject, given that timetables are already packed and are already pressured. Some of this will be more appropriate for school leaders, for those people who are involved in actively setting and deciding what the timetable will look like. But I do think it's really important that schools have these conversations and have these discussions in order for them to be able to really understand what it is they're going to do and how they're going to do it. Obviously, the government guidance changed. That originally we had hoped that from the beginning of September 2021, relationships and sex education would be mandatory in all schools. In light of the COVID pandemic and the very real and very true operational difficulties that schools are experiencing, that mandatory requirement has been delayed until the summer term 2021. That does give schools a good opportunity to take a break, to take some stock, to think about how they are going to timetable relationships and sex education and or PSHE. And hopefully the next couple of things that I'm going to speak about is going to shed a little bit of light on some of the processes that you can go through. In terms of what a curriculum looks like, curriculum planning is really hard. It is really difficult to sit down with a blank sheet of paper and say, this is what my long-term planning is going to look like. I remember my years as a classroom teacher, I would sometimes struggle to do that for specific years. So the idea that schools or particular leaders in schools are going to have to sit down and do that for the whole of those young people's school lives can be quite a daunting task. So at Brook, we have come up with some suggestions for how we think people can approach structuring and creating their PSHE curriculum. The first two things we think schools really need to take into account are core values relating to relationships and sex education and relationships education. Schools have to really understand what it is they want to be saying about it and how they want to be teaching it. One of the things that schools will have to do when they try to secure a position on what their core values will be with regards to teaching PSHE or RSE is to really understand and engage with the lived experience of the young people who make up their student body. Schools are really good at doing that anyway, but one of the things that I think a temptation that can sometimes happen when we get something like a whole new subject being added to the mandatory roster is that we reach for resources and guidance from all sorts of different places, and we put together a curriculum that doesn't actually start with where the young people are. And so if you have the freedom and the opportunity right now to be setting and creating your own curriculum, I really would encourage you and advise you to spend some time reflecting upon the lived experiences of the young people in your school. One of the things that I've learned in my time at Brook is that whilst we have very clear and concise core messages when we're teaching a topic, for example, healthy relationships, we've learnt that how we speak about healthy relationships with different year groups and how we speak about healthy relationships in different parts of the country to different groups of students changes because the lived experience of those students changes. So I think it's really important, and I would really encourage schools to have open and honest discussions about what the lived experiences of their young people are with regards to relationships and with regards to sex and relationships. Because if you are approaching it from a point of view of what your young people need, you will be providing a really good curriculum. The second part of building a PSHE curriculum is around about what that will look like practically. And that is around what the teacher model structure will look like and what the timetabling will look like. And I will speak about some different timetabling options in a second. Once the mechanics of it are in place, the key part of any implementation of a new curriculum is around the pedagogy and how it's going to be delivered. And the government and Brook very strongly recommends a whole school spiral curriculum. And I will speak about a spiral curriculum in a few moments' time, but I think if you build your curriculum around the idea of a spiral, and this is very tried and tested, and schools up and down the country adopt spiral curriculums for all sorts of other subjects as it is, but a spiral curriculum in which content is visited and then revisited with more complexity as young people get older, as their cognitive abilities change, and of course as their experiencing changes, is a really positive way to embed the core concepts of healthy relationships, good relationships, and keeping yourself safe. Once the curriculum has been established, once the pedagogy has been secured and everybody's on board with that, we can then move into the granular detail of what the curriculum looks like. And that can be lesson planning, that can be resources, that can be what individual sessions, what individual lessons will look like. We do think it's really important that parents and carers are involved, and we absolutely understand that this is an area that has caused difficulty. The alliance between parents, carers and the school is a really, really precious one. And again, it's one that schools and teachers and head teachers up and down the country manage really well and nurture really well. And I think in terms of parent and carer involvement, holding on to what your school's core values are, holding on to what you believe young people need to learn in order for them to live safe and happy and fulfilled lives. And then being able to communicate that in a sensitive and open and understanding way with your parent and carers' bodies will be really, really helpful. The final part of the puzzle is around monitoring and evaluation. Being able to be confident in saying that the curriculum that you're providing, that the lessons that your teachers are teaching are having an impact, that young people are learning from them, that young people are empowered to take care of their health and their well-being, that young people understand what healthy relationships and unhealthy relationships look like, is really important. We are acutely aware of teachers' workloads, and at Brook we absolutely do not want to be adding lots of extra work to teachers. So later on in this recording I will speak a little bit about some light touch evaluation ideas that you could use with your students in order not just to check their learning but to check that progress is as you would like it to be. There are a number of teaching structures and timetabling options for PSHE and relationships and sex education. And a lot of this will already have been decided because you're watching this at the beginning of September and the academic year. And so timetables will already have been set. At Brook, we see all sorts of different approaches to timetabling PSHE and RSE, from specific discrete timetabled lessons once a week, which are taught by specialist PSHE, RSE, citizenship teachers, through to a rolling programme of timetabled lessons which changes every week, through to PSHE and RSE being taught in registration or form time, or to it being delegated to outside organisations who come in for specific terms, or for drop-down days, which is a model that certainly gained a lot of traction about 5 to 10 years ago. However, we are seeing more and more schools moving away from drop-down days and trying to find room in the timetable to give these subjects discrete time. Once you or your school have figured out what the teaching of these subjects will look like in a practical sense, the next step is about thinking about what the curriculum model will be, what the curriculum will look like. And I think if I were to say that there were to be one thing that I would really like you to take away from all of the work that Brook is going to be doing and speaking about with regards to mandatory relationships and sex education during Sexual Health Week, but also for the rest of the year, it is the idea of the spiral curriculum. For me, a spiral curriculum is the most effective way of allowing young people to access the information that they need, to develop the skills that they need to at a time and a pace that is right for them, but also allows these skills, these topics, this information to be visited and revisited as their lives and as the world around them changes. Now, schools already structure lots of work through spiral curriculums, and they do it really well, so I don't want to be teaching you stuff that you already know. But the core idea of a spiral curriculum is that any subject can be taught in some intellectually honest form to any child at any stage of their development. And that a curriculum should revisit those basic ideas and should build upon them until the student has grasped the full formal concept. So just to give you a bit of context with a topic that you will be teaching as part of mandatory relationships education, something like healthy relationships. So the concept of healthy relationships can be taught really effectively to a young person who is in year 1 all the way up to year 13. So in the very early years, we might look at healthy relationships with regards to family types and different types of families. Who are the different people who are in our household? How does that look the same, or how does that look different to my friend's household down the street or to my neighbour's household? We can then revisit healthy relationships again, perhaps later on in the curriculum, around about year 2 or year 3, where we look at friendships and look at what makes positive friendships. How do you need to work at a friendship? How do we create a friendship? How do we deal when friendships change or friendships end? Further up the school, we can look at healthy relationships with regards to bullying, what bullying looks like. How do we know when a relationship is good for us and healthy for us and nurtures us? How do we know when a relationship is the opposite of those things? Healthy relationships again can be revisited when young people transition between primary and secondary school, which is always a time that we know needs special care and special attention. Again, new types of friendships are established when young people transition between the two schools. Healthy relationships can be examined again once young people start to be interested and start to think about becoming sexually active, if that's something that's appropriate for them. And we can look at what a healthy relationship looks like in a sexual sense, helping young people to understand what pressure and sexual pressure looks like. Healthy relationships can be expanded beyond the emotive and family relationship sense through to the sexual relationship sense, and then looking later on in the school curriculum at things like power and coercion, and how can we spot these things in a relationship when we look at the different ways that young people can be exploited, whether it's sexual exploitation, whether it's grooming, looking at the notion of how relationships are central to that, and how we can help young people to build self-worth and resilience, which will allow them to counter some negative influences that they will come across. Each of those different strands are all part of the same concept of healthy relationships. And we would really encourage you to think about the spiral curriculum in sense of the young person's journey throughout each year in school. Sometimes when we are teaching in the classroom, we very much focus on the thing that is in front of us at the moment. I've got this lesson to teach before I go off and teach the rest of my lessons in the afternoon. It's on healthy relationships. I will follow the plan or that resource or that idea, and it will be boxed off at the beginning and boxed off at the end. And those sort of sessions exist, and sometimes they need to exist because of the myriad of other things that teachers are having to deal with and having to juggle at the same time. But if we want to really create a curriculum that is really going to benefit young people and is going to equip them to live lives in quite a complex world, I think we should be, or I certainly encourage schools to think outside of individual lessons and to be thinking about what the curriculum looks like at a whole. And this kind of goes back to what I was saying at the very beginning about what are the school's core values. What is your school going to be saying about healthy relationships? What are the messages? What do you want your young people to understand about them? And then those can be revisited in those discrete lessons when you're looking at healthy relationships, but also at a whole myriad of different points in the school curriculum as well. So the idea between a spiral curriculum is that new content is introduced, it is then revisited, and it is then expanded upon as young people's lives change, as they grow up, and as their cognitive abilities grow. So I would now like to speak a little bit about the nuts and bolts of how to deliver RSE within your school and within your classroom. Bearing in mind what we've just spoken about with regards to the spiral curriculum, in terms of what we think good pedagogy looks like in Brook, we have put together a series of steps that we think will result in good learning, good teaching and learning with regards to these subjects. We begin by identifying the essential concepts for each topic. We think this does a number of things. We think that this works pedagogically, and of course it will be no surprise that actually if we know what we are planning to teach and what we are planning to say about something, then the teaching and learning is always better. Very few teachers think that it's an accidental process. But also we encourage really understanding what it is you're going to be saying about these topics. Because for the most part, teachers who will be teaching these topics are not subject specialists. I remember from my days as a teacher, I had to teach PSHE and RSE, and I was absolutely not a subject specialist in it. And that creates all sorts of difficulties and anxieties for the teacher, and it can at times pose real challenges. So if you are teaching these subjects, knowing in advance what are the key messages that you want your young people to understand by the end of the session. We then move on to creating a safe learning environment, and I think that's really significant with regards to these subjects. You will already create a safe learning environment because that's what teachers do day in, day out. They create a good, positive, healthy environment that enables children to learn. However, this subject will be different to your normal teaching subject. And so the environment will be different, the dynamic will be different. And I would really encourage you at the start of each RSE lesson or each PSHE lesson, just to take a few moments to remind yourself that this is different. Your classroom physically is the same as it was before, but this is different to your classroom in the previous lesson and what your classroom will be like in the subsequent lesson. And I think for all of us, pupils and teachers, that's really important for us to remember that. Things are different in the RSE, PSHE classroom. How we approach things are different. And I think just understanding that dynamic is at play is really helpful. Figuring out the sequence of your lessons, I think, is going to increase your confidence and the outcomes for young people. I absolutely understand the difficulties of PSHE being on a rolling programme, and all of a sudden you find out that you thought you had one lesson next lesson, and actually you don't. You have a strange group coming in and you're teaching PSHE to them. And that happens to everybody with the best will in the world, but really understanding what it is you're aiming to do with this specific sequence of lessons will make things much less stressful for you and will make the learning more efficacious for students. And I don't think that that needs to be in absolutely fine, granular detail. But I think knowing where you're starting from and where you're hoping to get to will make the learning better and will make your job easier. I think it's always tempting to think that young people have much more prior knowledge than they do. And it's a really difficult process, especially I think sometimes for teachers who don't teach in subjective subjects to get their head around that when we are working in the PSHE RSE classroom, prior knowledge may not be correct prior knowledge. In fact, it might be really wrong, and it might be based upon a whole load of incorrect assumptions. So we absolutely need to build on prior knowledge, and I know that I've certainly stood in front of a PSHE lesson and been told that we did this topic last year, and the very activity that I had planned to do with them they did last year as well. So checking in with the prior knowledge of your young people is really significant and really important, and not making assumptions because as I said before, sometimes we think young people know more than they actually do. Addressing any misconceptions and tailoring your teaching to prevent them is really significant. And I think after the spiral curriculum, my kind of next kind of key piece of golden advice is always give yourself room and space at the end of the session to address misconceptions and to deal with questions. That's also a really vital space for safeguarding as well. Misconceptions happen all the time and with the best will in the world, and you can know your subject matter inside out and there can still be misconceptions. You know, think about a time when you have taught the most brilliant lesson in your subject and you've used the most amazing resources and everything has gone perfectly, and yet there are still one or two children who have absolutely almost been part of a different lesson entirely, haven't they? And they've picked up on something else and it's not sunk in. And so taking time to look at misconceptions and to actively challenging them, and for you to feel okay in challenging misconceptions. You know, sometimes misconceptions will make you feel really uncomfortable. And I sometimes, you know, when we are in a PSHE classroom, we are often at the limits of our comfort zone, and it can take quite a lot of bravery to address misconceptions, but it is always worth it, and young people will always be grateful to you for doing so. Utilising exposition and repetition, scaffolding, and giving time and space for critical thinking. These are all things that you will do anyway. I think I would remind you that you can't be the subject expert on every part of PSHE or on every part of relationships and sex education. And you can't control what young people are going to ask, what young people are going to think, and what young people are going to be interested in. So there is a point of again, moving to the edge of the comfort zone and allowing young people the space and time to think critically and to ask questions. And I think the last part of the pedagogy, which is really important, is about just making sure that your resources and the content aligns to your approach. So making sure that the work that you do, that any resources that you do, that any videos that you share, that any critical articles that you use actually relate to the lived experience of those young people. Make sure that it's inclusive. Make sure that it's diverse. These are not terms that are there to trip you up. There are some really toxic messages in the media at the moment that can make people feel scared and intimidated about trying to be inclusive and trying to be diverse. And actually what we're really trying to do is just to communicate with young people, to show them that we understand that there are differences, that we understand that there is diversity, and that we embrace that and that we reflect that in the resources and the content that we bring to the table when we're trying to put together a lesson. So I'm sharing with you now a question that we get asked all the time at Brook, and that is, what should a PSHE lesson look like? How should it be structured? And we've put together this 7-part session plan for how we think really good learning takes place in the RSE PSHE classroom. This will look quite familiar to you anyway, and you probably do structure many of your existing lessons like this. So I won't take you through it line by line, but I would like to highlight a couple of sections of this lesson structure that I think are really important, and that's when we have looked at where learning is most efficacious in the PSHE RSE classroom, we found that these parts are particularly vital. The first thing I'd really like to draw your attention to is the group agreement, and I spoke about this a little bit earlier on, that the RSE PSHE classroom will be different slightly to your normal classroom, and it's always a good idea to acknowledge that difference, to acknowledge the fact that this is not a subject that you perhaps would normally be teaching, especially if you're a secondary school teacher, and to use a group agreement just to underline that things are slightly different, and this is a slightly different topic and a slightly different way of learning that your young people are perhaps normally used to. And a group agreement is about creating a safe space where young people can explore, can understand, can learn, and can ask questions. And you might be absolutely fine in teaching relationships and sex education. You might be really, really confident about it. Or you might be a bit nervous and you might be a bit worried about it. And chances are you're going to have people in your classroom who are going to be feeling the exact same range of emotions. And for some people, these subjects will be harder to work with than others. And so creating that group agreement in saying collegiately, this is how we're going to work together, we found that to be really significant and really helpful. In terms of a warm-up, the notion there is the idea that it breaks the ice, that we see that this is a different lesson from the one that we were working on before. But it's also a really, really good opportunity for you to understand prior learning and prior knowledge. And as I said before, sometimes we think that young people know much, much more than we do about these topics, but very often that's not the case. So an activity which enables you to, start with some of those assessment for learning techniques, understand where they've come from, will really help you to be able to figure out where you want to take them. In terms of the main activity, we would always recommend that age-old process of linking back to learning outcomes, scaffolding, critical thinking, giving time and space with which to reflect upon things. Young people are very used to the drill of education, so they are very used to thinking about the academic concept, processing it, understanding it, perhaps talking about it or writing about it. But a lot of work in the PSHE or RSE classroom is personal work as well. And there's a lot of processing that needs to be done during those sessions. And I think that processing is slightly different to academic processing. And so I think sometimes, especially if we're nervous about teaching a subject, we can think we have to have them actively engaged with a worksheet, writing stuff down all the time. But sometimes conversation is needed. Sometimes space is needed for thinking. Sometimes space is needed for processing. So young people can really understand what this subject and what this topic means for them. The final part of the structure, which I think is really important that we all consider when we're teaching PSHE or RSE, is the follow-up of any safeguarding concerns or issues that have arisen during the session. Again, schools are amazing at safeguarding young people, and I think that's something that's very frequently forgotten, that schools are at the front line of safeguarding, and schools do safeguard young people really, really well. But a PSHE RSE lesson is about the personal. It is about the lived experiences of young people, and by its very nature, we may find that there are more opportunities for disclosure during one of these sorts of lessons than there are during a different lesson, for example. And it's just about being aware of that and being attuned to that, and exercising your professional curiosity. I know that certainly lots of safeguarding begins with a gut feeling, begins with the idea that there's something that is just not quite right here and is not quite adding up. And it can be difficult when you are teaching a subject that you may not be really comfortable with or really familiar with, and you're having to manage all sorts of different things at once whilst thinking about what you're going to do afterwards. But I would just encourage you to walk into every one of these lessons with your eyes open, in the sense that this is in the personal domain. It's not so much in the academic domain. And when you work in the personal domain, the opportunities for safeguarding disclosures are increased. When it comes to assessment for these subjects, the key factor here for me is assessment for learning. That at the moment there is no formal examined requirement for these subjects. And so that gives schools and that gives teachers an opportunity to really look at where young people start and where young people end up. And so in terms of how we should assess and how we should monitor PSHE and RSE, my recommendation would be that you root it deeply in assessment for learning principles. I think schools will approach it differently, and some schools will absolutely have workbooks and folders that will follow young people through, and some schools there will certainly be a predominance on written work and written capturing of progress, and in other schools they will adopt a different approach. And I think my suggestion would be that you use the wide range of assessment for learning tools that are available to us. And we don't just need to show progress by something written at the end of a session or at the end of the term or at the end of the year. We can assess progress using peer evaluation, using self-evaluation. We can assess progress through speaking and listening activities. If you are new to this, I'd absolutely recommend you collar an English teacher somewhere in the corridor in your school and ask them about how do you assess learning through speaking and listening activities, because they've been doing that for years. Really understanding, have young people grasped what you hope they would have grasped in this session is going to be the fundamental part of your assessment. And that can be done through a written account, it can be done through written questions, it can be done through a written report, but it can also be done conversationally. And often it's those conversations that are the most important demonstrator of the progress that young people have made. In a practical sense, we know what teachers' workloads are like. We know what teachers' marking workloads are like. And so a written assignment that is set for young people may not get marked until a couple of weeks later, a couple of months later, or if at all, given the competing priorities on teachers' workloads. And by that time, the work will be forgotten, and so any erroneous ideas or misconceptions just won't have been picked up on. So we would really recommend utilising conversation, utilising things like post-it notes. What have you learned in this lesson? 3 things that you have learned in this lesson, and checking in to make sure that the concepts have been understood and processed in a way so there is no misconceptions. So that was a really quick and whistle-stop tour of some of the things that I think we need to be thinking about as we start to roll out mandatory relationships education and mandatory relationships and sex education. I think it's worth noting here that I'm speaking to you at a really challenging time. I'm recording this in the middle of August, and at the moment the press is full of stories about schools reopening after the COVID lockdown. And of course, schools are not reopening after the COVID lockdown because schools have been open all the time. So it's just that young people are returning to schools in the main after the lockdown. It presents you and organisations like Brook with massive challenges. In all honesty, the public health and the well-being emergencies that are impacting young people have happened. They happened during lockdown. And the challenge that we all face now is, how do we address them? How do we mitigate the impact of them? And how do we stop those emergencies becoming worse? And you have to do all of that whilst integrating young people back into schools, whilst getting them caught up on all of that missed work and 1,001 other things that is the daily lot of teaching in the UK at the moment. I think you could be forgiven for perhaps feeling a bit overwhelmed, for perhaps feeling a bit anxious. And what I would like to say to that is that that's completely normal. And at this stage, mandatory relationships education and relationships and sex education is not going to be rolled out perfectly. You know, if you are that one teacher in the school who's been told, right, it's your job, go and get us ready for mandatory RSE, you could be absolutely forgiven for quaking in your boots, even without the COVID pandemic. So I would like to say that you're not going to get it right first time, every time. That mandatory RSE will be a process, and it will be a process, and your curriculum will experience different iterations as you and your school and your teams become more confident with the subject matter and understanding what mandatory RSE actually looks like as a timetable subject. We're not going to be able to pull it off the shelf, you know, fully formed, absolutely perfectly planned out, with every eventuality catered for. There is definitely going to be a lot of feeling our way through it in these initial years. But there are lots of organisations out there to support you, the PSHE Association, SEF and Brook. We absolutely are standing shoulder to shoulder with you as you implement mandatory RSE throughout this academic year. So thank you very much for watching and listening, and I hope you find these short digital recordings and the conversations that we are going to be hosting useful as we go through Sexual Health Week 2020 and indeed as you roll out mandatory RSE across this academic year. My final words are just to say thank you. Thank you for inviting Brook into your classroom. Thank you for giving us the time and space to talk about these subjects, which we feel really passionate about. If you would like help, if you would like us to come and work with your school, if you would like some guidance, check out our web pages, check out our web presence, or get in touch with us. We never underestimate what an important and privileged place it is to be invited into your classrooms and for you to give us the time that you do. So thank you very much and enjoy Sexual Health Week 2020.